I'm Adam Leonberger, the Franklin County Extension Agent for Horticulture. I'm here to talk to you guys this afternoon about backyard composting. First of all, happy Earth Day to everybody. It's a wonderful sunny day here in Franklin County, and I'm happy to be able to share this all with you guys. First up, we're just a little bit what we're going to go over. We're going to quickly cover what actually is composting, why would we want to compost, how to do it, and some different methods to accomplish that. So composting is a natural process. It's us taking advantage of the natural rotting, decaying process that happens with organic matter and using that to our advantage. That's really what all this is. Some people have different motivations for this, whether to produce another outlet for waste reduction or deal with waste. Other people are seeing that other people use composting as a very intentional way to create their own fertilizer for their gardens. So why do we compost specifically? Some of the reasons we really like to be able to make compost is it's organic matter. I know here in Franklin County, a lot of the complaints I hear from people about the soils is either they don't have any soil, it's just rock and a little bit of clay, or it's heavy clay and doesn't ever drain well. Typically our soils are around Kentucky are somewhere in the 3 to 5% organic matter range. And some of the ways that you can really improve or create soil, improve that heavy clay or actually create some soil is to add organic matter back to that soil. If you are adding compost on a regular basis, you can actually build that up to about 10% organic matter. And that may not seem like a big increase, but that extra 5% does a lot of work in the soil. Some of the increasement there is the fact that not only does the compost continue to break down and release nutrients to the plants, it'll actually over time allow that soil to hold on to more nutrients than it would normally. So that way they aren't leaching, rain and water irrigation isn't leaching soil, the fertilizer and the nutrients out of that soil. It's staying in where the plants can get to it. It's also, like I mentioned before, with the clay structure, it's improving the soil structure. So not only just allowing more better structure, better friability, making up so that way it breaks up to smaller pieces more easily. It'll improve the aeration of it, so that way the roots can breathe better. That improves drainage, and this isn't necessarily drainage on top of the surface. If you're on a hillside, you're obviously your water is still going to drain off the top of the surface. When we're talking about drainage, we're really talking about internal drainage. So we're talking about how well that water will move through the soil column itself. So once it gets into the soil, does it sit there or like it would in a heavy clay, or does it drain on through and get to and keep moving through? Does it stay soggy, or does it get wet and drain out? And it actually, because it improves that overall soil structure, it does actually reduce the erosion. So even if you are on a hillside, you will still keep, if you leave bare soil, yeah, you'll get some erosion. But if you can build that organic matter up onto it, it'll actually improve the ability and resist more erosion. So that way you lose less of it down the hill. One other reason that a lot of people try to compost is it helps reduce waste. So on average, Americans produce about 4 pounds of waste per person per day, and about a little less than half of that can be either recycled or composted. So by composting, we're kind of diverting some of that waste out of the landfills. It's also has that additional benefit of those garbage trucks, those waste trucks don't have to haul that waste around. So that's saving on fuel as well. So that's additional tonnage that they aren't trying to travel to the dump with, and that's less fuel that they're burning. So you've got a couple layers of environmental impacts there that we can really help improve on that from that standpoint. Just showing that's a similar thing in some information in a different format. This is based on 2012 on total amount of solid waste that was being discarded in 2012 in the EPA. We see here, I've pulled these couple little sections out here. There's the wood, yard trimmings, and food waste. That whole category together makes about 38%. So that's a lot. That's a large chunk out of it that can be composted at home or composted at your local. Some communities have local drop-off points where you can drop off yard waste. So those are some places that you can help divert that compost back out, or that material back away, so it's not going into landfills. And just kind of hit that point again, each year Kentucky is throwing away about 600 tons of food waste every year. And that's specifically food waste that could easily be composted if we had facilities, or if people composted these things at home. So how does composting work? Well, it's pretty simple. It's a natural process. And because it's a natural process, it's a living natural process, it requires the same things that you and I do: food, air, water, and the right temperatures. There's a lot of different players, a lot of different organisms that help with this, but the main ones are actually bacteria and fungi doing the heavy lifting on breaking this stuff down. So we really want to focus on trying to make sure that those two categories of organisms are really happy. One way that you can really make sure that you are keeping them happy and make sure that these are working as peak levels is really making sure that they get the right nutrients. This is just like you and I need to have the right proper nutrition. Giving them the right amount of these organisms right food will allow them to break things down as quickly as possible. So we break the amounts, the compostables, down into two categories: our browns that are high in carbon, and greens which are high in nitrogen. The browns are high in carbon. These are good things like your dry leaves, dry grass, newspaper, wood chips, stuff like this. A lot of your materials that you would out around the house that you could also sometimes see people use as mulches can a lot of times be in that brown high carbon area. These materials don't break down very quickly, which is why we use them as mulch a lot of times. But if we have too much of it produced on the property, sometimes you need to compost that. But they don't break down very quickly. So we add in some of these higher nitrogen materials into this vegetable, fruit waste. These are materials that break down really quickly. But we don't want them to break down too quick, because then we're not producing enough things and material going into to keep that compost activity going. So you want to mix these in at about 25 to 30 parts to 1 part of green. That'll provide enough nutrients to break down the browns and get them actually broken down, slow down the green part a little bit. That way we can kind of use them and get everything broken down nice and evenly together. When we talk about the right food, we also obviously we got all the food waste here that can go in. Those are very easy, common things to compost. Clothes dryer lint, it works great as long as you're not doing a load of microfiber, polyester, fleece jackets, all that. As long as those are all, most of that lint's going to be obviously polyester and plastics, not really compostable. But if you're doing cotton sheets, bed sheets, linens, cotton t-shirts, jeans, stuff like that natural plant-based clothing, that can go into that clothes dryer from those loads can easily go into your compost instead. Hair, whether that's your hair, pet hair, wherever, that can easily be composted. Yard waste, sawdust in small amounts. So essentially, the common way I've seen it be put before is if it grows, it goes. So if you see it growing out in the yard, if it grows elsewhere on the ground, it can go directly into the compost. Some of the things you want to make sure that you're avoiding from the compost are going to be things like meat, bones, fish, baked goods, and dairy. The reason that we want to avoid doing that, put those in there, is because those are often attractants to mice, raccoons, possums, stuff like that maybe we don't really want digging into our compost or up near our houses. The fats, greases, and oils we want to avoid putting in there, because that will actually coat the bacteria and fungi, and that will slow down and inhibit them from having access to not only oxygen and water, but also the food that we're trying, this waste that we're trying to break down. The next category of the things that we're trying to keep out of the waste is going to be things like pet waste, kitty litter, weeds, hard to kill weeds and weed seeds, and diseased plants. The reason for this is because most home composters are not getting up to high enough temperatures to kill off any pathogens or kill off any of these weeds. So if we are putting the pest waste in, there's a potential that any pathogens there could be surviving that compost facility process, and you're putting those human pathogens potentially all over your vegetable garden. Similar with the weed seeds, they're gonna survive through there. You go spread that back out. Now you've just made your whole you've made your whole gardening process a lot harder because now you have diseases and weeds. Now you're battling even further. Black walnut leaves and twigs. If anybody's ever tried to grow tomatoes near a black walnut by accident, you'll know those are really sensitive to the black walnut. It'll actually start wilting at that point. Black walnuts produce a chemical in the leaves, roots, and twigs and fruit. It's kind of chemical warfare against other competing plants. So that chemical will actually carry through the compost as well. And if you put any compost with that black walnut near sensitive plants like your tomatoes and peppers, they'll start what we often usually refer to as black walnut wilt. So the plants will literally start wilting like they're in drought, even though they have enough water. That black walnut chemical is attacking and killing the roots of the tomatoes and the other plants. Yard waste that's been treated with chemicals. The most common, I think, option here, case here is if you had a lawn that's been treated with a herbicide. I believe even by the label, it usually specifies the number of weeks or number of cuttings that you need to go through before you can compost and remove those clippings. Those herbicides sometimes will persist in the environment or on that grass, and if you put it in the compost, it may not. It's a good chance it could still survive and persist through that compost as well, and you'll have trouble with the plants the way you put that there. So that's one of the reasons. Usually check the label, but typically if it's on a lawn, it's mowed at least 3 times before you could take anything off to compost. Coal and charcoal. The issue here is the fact that a lot of the coal and charcoal have some impurities in it, heavy metals or some other toxic materials that you don't really want to be onto a food production site. If you have wood ash or some other wood coals in it, that's fine. In small amounts, it can raise the pH and make it a little harder. But that's not going to have. They aren't going to have the same contaminants as coal or charcoal is going to have. Other big thing that we need, not only do they need food, but they need water. So we really want to make sure that they keep about 50 to 60% moisture in the actual compost. So if you wring out a sponge really well, down to just being damp, that feeling is what you're looking for as far as the compost goes. If it's crunchy, it's dry. If it's crunchy and dry, you want to add more water to it. If the compost is too wet, you want to make sure you turn it more frequently to allow more airflow and to allow it to dry, that moisture level to go down. And by turning it, that really just all we're talking about there is trying to take the whole pile and flip it over on top of itself. Obviously, if you have a large pile, it's not going to be able to just do it in one route. Usually at that point, we're just taking the top layer off, turn it onto the bottom, or set it off to the side, and just put everything, layer by layer, flipping it over onto itself. Or if it's a defined structures, you pull stuff from the bottom and just put it back on top. So that way, the top, ideally, at the end, you want the top layer at the bottom and the bottom layer on the top. So you're just trying to invert the whole pile. Mix it all up, making sure that everything is getting access to being decomposed and composted. As far as the size of this goes, we want to keep the microbes warm and happy. They have a very specific temperature that they're trying to work at, and if you give them a large enough pile, they will maintain that temperature on their own. If it gets too hot, they'll slow down. It'll start killing off the microbes. It'll naturally cool itself off. If it's too cold, typically as long as you're not going to have the issue of being too cold as long as you keep it large enough. And by large enough, we really want it to be 3 feet on all sides, so length, width, and height. If you are on a larger property and you are producing a lot more material, you can make it wider, but you really want to try to make it as the width and depth of it to the height, try to match it to how much you're producing, so you're maintaining about 3 feet, 3 feet tall as well. The reason for that is even in summer, we don't have an issue of it getting too cold, but in the winter, you want to keep things still growing, still decomposing and still breaking down, because you're still, obviously, it's winter, we're still eating, we're still producing food waste and adding it to the compost. So we want that to break down still too. If you keep it that side, that at least 3 feet, the outer layers will stop decomposing very quickly, but the inside of it, that core, is still going to keep still being active still. So you want to maintain that as much as you can. If you're not producing even enough to keep it 3 feet on each side and keep it deep enough, small household, or you're not have enough things going on, it's not an issue necessarily for too cold. It will stop over the winter. It'll stop decomposing, but you'll have levels kind of build up into it. But once we start warming up, it'll start breaking down again on its own too. As far as the actual structure, the home for this compost bin, we can go from anything very, very simple. I've seen it where people have taken literally just a pile and started piling, have designated space in their garden where they just started piling things onto it. You can make a compost pile. It can even just, if you're looking for something a little more refined but don't have the means, you can dig a pit. You can literally just dig a hole in the ground and start putting compost in on top of that. Once it's filled, to hop it back with soil. Even if it's mounted up a little bit, it will, as it decomposes, shrink back down. If you want a little bit more structured things, so that way you can use that compost after it's finished, the structures really help with that. That way you can have a more defined area that you can kind of turn and have a space to keep any pets out a little bit easier that way too. Some of the simplest structure the cheapest structure I've been able to find is going to be using something like this wire meshing or poultry netting, chicken wire, a 3 foot tall, 3 foot wide section, 10 feet long, wrapped into a circle. That'll give you about a 3 foot wide circle. So that'll be, if you get it to be 3 foot wide section and 10 feet long, when that goes into a circle, you'll have a little over 3 foot diameter, and there's your 3 foot by 3 foot. You can use taller if you're producing a lot more. You just want to be mindful of who's putting compost in there. I know I made a mistake of using 4 foot tall fencing before. My wife's only 5 foot tall, so she complained a little bit the fact that she had to take the compost up to essentially nose level to dump it in. So just be careful of that, mindful of that as well. You can also use concrete blocks. Nice thing about this is the fact that because it's a concrete product, it's brick and stone mortar, it's not going to decompose. So you could build, if you use concrete blocks, you're pretty much using this for a lifetime at this point. Not going to have any problems there. And something like this is just kind of a defined, contained pile. Same with the wood structure. You can use scrap wood. You can use untreated lumber. You can use pressure treated lumber. I would caution that if your pressure treated lumber I don't remember the age on this, but if it's any of the older stuff that is the old copper arsenic pressure treated stuff, I would not use it for this. The newer pressure treated lumbers now use just strictly copper based chemicals to preserve it, preservatives, which copper is it is a heavy metal, but it is a very common heavy metal. That's what we use in a lot of piping, water pipes. It's also pretty common in our soils as well. So I have not seen any conclusive evidence that these newer pressure treated chemicals would cause any issues in the soil or in the compost itself. If you concerned about it, you can use unpressure treated lumber. From what I've seen, you'll probably get about for at least 5 years out of it before it starts rotting out, and then you just have to rebuild it from there. If people are looking for, there are also commercial options. There's these plastic closed composters. It's essentially like a trash can with no bottom on it. There's no floor in this, so it sits directly. The whole bottom is open to the ground. There's little doors on the side to this that we can open it up and turn the compost. So this would be where you pull out from the bottom and dump it back in the top. That's how you turn the compost there. It has a nice little lid, so that way you can have better control of moisture in and out of it. So if you have it too wet, not only can you turn it, you can also leave the lid off. If it's too dry, you can either grab a hose or leave it off during a rain event, and that way it gets a little bit of water there. Tumblers seem to be a fairly popular product out there. I also get a lot of complaints about the fact that they're not working well. I don't know the exact reason for it. I don't know if there's too much airflow all the way around, so that it doesn't get up enough temperature, if people are not putting enough material into it, if it's letting too much air and it's breaking down too quickly. I don't know. I haven't seen or been able to get one of them work well for myself. I know other people that have had them, good luck with it. Some of the recommendations I have seen with the tumblers, though, is because it's kind of a bit more defined and you can't, everything's constantly being mixed up. Is actually to have two different composters, so tumblers. So you have one tumbler to start to kind of fill up. You get everything almost composted. Then you kind of just keep it turning to kind of finish that composition and finish composting to a finished material. And then you start at that time when you decide that you want to let it kind of finish out, you start using it and loading up the second one. So that way you have kind of switch alternating back and forth. So one's being filled up, the other one's kind of maturing and kind of finishing out. And you just kind of switch back and forth. A little bit more little fancier versions of these composters can be made out of these 3-bin systems. It can be used with pallets and T-posts. You can build it with wood and wire. If you're pulling from pallets, be careful pulling from businesses' loading docks. A lot of times those companies are either selling them off to companies to repair and reuse the pallets, or they have some other use for those. Always ask first before you take off somebody's loading dock. Don't just assume it's trash. So there's that. The wood here, these are just 3 boxes similar to what we saw with the single composters. These are just in series together, and then they've put a wire mesh in front of it just to kind of keep it contained and still allow a lot of airflow as well. Now we got those different systems set up. That's the different houses. There are 2 different methods that we can typically take as far as how to compost. You have the hot method and cold method. Hot method, obviously we're getting up to higher temperatures. Because we're getting to higher temperatures, those chemical reactions are taking less time. So compost broken down quicker and you get a finished product a lot more, with less amount of time. Trade-off there is that it does require a lot more labor and a lot more material going into that compost on a regular basis. It is good. This is the method that if you were putting weed seeds or pathogens, sick plants into it, this is the method to be able to kill those weed seeds and pathogens and make sure that you have a pasteurized product at the end. It kind of self-pasteurizes throughout the process. The cold method, the advantages here, it does take longer. The advantage is that it takes less effort. I'm a self-proclaimed lazy gardener, so this is the method that I always kind of take. I've referred to it before as almost like my garden trash pile. Everything goes out of the garden, it just goes right into the compost bin, and it just stays there until the compost bin is too full and I have to clean it out at that point. One of the trade-offs there, because we're not really actively managing it, not turning it on a regular basis, not adding that much material to it, those temperatures aren't getting up high enough to self-pasteurize, and your weed seeds and pathogens aren't being killed out. So with the hot method, this is where you really need to pay attention to the proper food at that point. Really making sure that you get that 25 to 30 parts of brown to 1 part of green material. That's really going to drive that chemical reaction to get that temperature really high. When you're doing that, a lot of times it's actually almost kind of easier to have the 3-bin system at that point. That way you can have a section that's for incoming compost. As that starts beginning that breakdown of it, you're moving that and turning that a few times. When it's about partway broken down, you can move that over to your working compost, making sure that that's still being turned and composted. When it's mostly finished, you go to that 3rd bin where it's finished compost and finally matured. Depending on how fast you're managing it, you likely could conceivably get this all the way finished, all the way through the process to finishing and resting in probably 6 to 8 weeks. That's assuming that you can push it, that we have a good summer temperature to help keep those temperatures really high. That's assuming all things perfect. Once it's in the finished compost, I would recommend giving it a week or 2 or 3 weeks to really kind of finish out that maturation period process and kind of finish out and kind of settle out. One of the tips to, as far as if you're doing the hot method and really trying to drive it either in a 3-bin system or a larger compost pile or something like that, is to monitor the temperatures on that. You want to you can use, they're not that expensive, but there's compost or soil thermometers. They look like giant meat thermometers that you stick in with just a 24 or 36-inch long probe on it. You'd stick it in there, and you can kind of tell. It would kind of tell you whether it's at the right temperature, or if it's getting too hot, too cold, or either way. If it's getting too hot, you need to turn it a little bit more, because otherwise it could, just like hay sometimes can do, it can catch fire on itself if you are working it too fast. The cold method, again, like I mentioned before, this is where you can kind of treat it almost like a garbage, like a trash pile, garden trash pile. This is a lot of times you see some, gardeners that will have, squash plants that are growing out of it, tomato plants growing out of their compost bin. That's just a better sign that the seeds are not being broken down. Those seeds are not being killed off in that compost there. It's not getting hot enough. One of the ways you can kind of really make sure that, one of the complaints I've heard from people on this method is the fact that if you're just kind of putting food scraps in there, you're going to get some flies or some other insects, hornets and stuff like that, that'll be buzzing and going in after that food waste. Easy method to get around that is to either have a corner here where, like, this corner has some old grass clippings piled up. You dump your food scraps. You take a handful of the grass clippings, the leaves, the mulch, whatever, and just kind of sprinkle on 1/2 inch or inch over top of it, just to keep the flies and hornets from buzzing it too much. And then this method here, it's going to take a little longer. It can take up to a year or a little longer for things to take down. Most of your food scraps are going to be broken down in 6 months to a year. Some things like corn cobs or avocado pits and skins, eggshells, that may take a little longer. Usually at that point, I just kind of leave them there. If I'm putting them in the vegetable garden, I turn out that compost onto it and just know that there's going to be some of these little things on it. Or you pick it out and put it back on top. So that way it can spin a little bit longer to break down. As far as using this compost, most of our compost, it's not going to be really a high nutrient content. It's not very dense. It's pretty wet, and at that point, it's gonna. If anybody's familiar, have played fertilizer before, you might have seen the triple numbers there, where it's the 10-10-10, 20-10-20. All that is, that's the actual relative percentage amount of nitrogen, of the nitrogen, potash, and phosphorus that's in that material. So there's NPK, that's the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potash. Most of your compost on average is going to be about 2-2-1, so it's pretty low. As far as putting that out and using it in the garden, we recommend about 1/2 inch to 1 inch layer for most flower and vegetable gardens. That's quite a bit higher than the actual. If you look at the total amount of nitrogen on it, that's actually quite a bit higher than what is actually recommended. The reason for that is because this compost is kind of a living material there. It's got so much material holding capacity. It's actually going to hold on to those nutrients for about 5 years before it gets it all out. So even though we're going to put on from mathematically, it's going to be a lot of nitrogen, a lot of fertilizer nutrients right away. It's going to be kind of a natural slow release fertilizer. So you're only going to be getting you're going to only get about 20% of that fertilizer in that first year, and so it'll break down over several years before it's kind of fully given up the whole ghost there. So as far as that goes, 1/2 inch to 1 inch layer is sufficient for most gardens. You can top dress it over top of other compost. If you're in the flower bed, you can just pull back the mulch layer, add 1/2 inch or inch around the root zone of those plants, and then put that mulch on top of it. So that way you can kind of use that fertilizer around the household. Vegetable gardens, same thing. Just put that 1/2 inch down to it. If you're tilling your garden, you can incorporate it into the soil beforehand. Otherwise, if you're doing a no-till vegetable garden, just kind of mix it into that soil right around the planting area. As with that, we do have some other resources for anybody that's interested. HO75 is UK's home composting guide. There's also, if anybody needs a little bit more help on constructing them, we've got instructions on the INRI 311, that's constructing a garbage can compost bin, or instructions on how to construct a wire mesh compost bin as well. If you'd like to go a little next level past that, there's also instructions on how to build your own vermicompost bin. That's a fancy word for worm bins. You can start becoming your own worm farmer at that point. With that, I'll take any questions. Thank you very much.